The umbrella, a seemingly mundane object within the brutal theater of this episode, operates, methinks, as a masterful piece of multi-layered symbolism. At its most immediate level, it represents the cruelest jest of a shape choices, a form that appears, to the casual eye, as deceptively simple, yet becomes an instrument of near certain death, through its intricate curves and its deceptively delicate stem. But hark, and let us now unfold its deeper implications. Protection versus vulnerability, that most human paradoxes, finds itself cruelly juxtaposed. For the umbrella, traditionally serving as a shield against the harshest of elements, becomes, in this unholy game, that very thing from which the players desperately require protection. Alas, this ironic inversion mirrors how those systems meant to safeguard society's vulnerable, social security, healthcare, and even financial institutions, can often, through some malignant alchemy, transform themselves into the very mechanisms of their destruction. And then there is the matter of class commentary, for the umbrella's difficulty level was not, 'tis plain to see, a random occurrence. Those who chose it were often the less strategic players, revealing how societal choices, often, through a cruel twist of fate, trap the uninformed. When Gi-hun, that poor soul, faces the umbrella's shape, his very terror becomes a manifestation of the paralyzing fear of all those who face systemic barriers that they did not truly understand when making their supposed choice. And what is a life but a series of choices made blindly? Consider, too, that the structural fragility inherent in the umbrella's precarious design, with its thin, brittle handle and its complex, unyielding curves, serves, I say, as a most apt metaphor for the fragile balance that so many maintain between survival and collapse in our own modern society, wherein one wrong move, one slight pressure in the wrong direction, and all that one had hoped for, all one had striven for, will shatter into the wind like so much shattered glass. And then we have the needle, a seemingly insignificant tool, but it is in such small things that fates are often decided. The needle emerges in this episode as a powerful symbol of both resourcefulness and of the abject desperation of those whose lot is to exist on the margins. Let us dissect its multi-layered symbolism. Firstly, we see that it is in its very insignificance, its smallness, that it reveals its potency, a subversion of power, where this seemingly insignificant tool becomes the key to survival, a profound commentary, if ever there was one, on how the powerless must rely upon the most meager of resources to overcome systemic challenges. And when Gi-hun, with that ingenuity he seems to possess, discovers the needle's potential to melt that honeycomb, we witness a clear metaphor for how the oppressed must somehow find creative methods to work within, or to subvert, the rules of a system designed only to grind them into dust. It is a tale of industrial commentary, wherein the needle, that basic tool of manual labor, becomes a weapon of survival, mirroring how the skills and knowledge of the working class, often dismissed and devalued by higher society, can become crucial tools of resistance. The very fact that the players must hide the needle also speaks to how the survival strategies of the poor are often criminalized by those in power, their attempts at merely existing cast aside as some form of illicit behavior. And how does such injustice sit with your conscience? And we see, too, the double edge, that ever-present danger that lurks within all attempts at surviving in an oppressive system. For like any tool used under such duress, the needle is both a chance at salvation and a possible path to self-destruction. For one wrong move could shatter that precious honeycomb, just as any desperate measures taken by the marginalized can often backfire and lead to catastrophic consequences. A truth as true as it is bitter. This duality reflects the precarious nature of survival strategies when those very systems are unfair from their very inception. Hark, for we now turn to the clock, a constant companion, always present, and which emerges in Episode 3 as a ruthless symbol of the brutal systemic control, and indeed, of mortality itself. Let us unpack its deeper significance, for the capitalism's tyranny of time is laid bare within this constant tick-tock. For the clock is more than just a countdown, embodies capitalism's relentless obsession with productivity and efficiency, where every second lost is not simply time wasted, but a sharp reminder of how modern systems commodify all of human existence into strict temporal units. Those players, like workers upon the factory floor, are now forced to perform intricate tasks. Under artificial time constraints, their very survival tied to these arbitrary deadlines, whilst also acting as an instrument of psychological warfare, wherein the visible countdown acts as a chilling method of torture, wherein its presence creates a constant feedback loop of anxiety, increasing the likelihood of failure. Such it is in our modern society, where the constant pressure of deadlines and time-based performance metrics creates conditions that only set up individuals for an almost inevitable fall. And mark well, the sound of the ticking itself becomes a form of brutal acoustic violence, each second echoing the player's diminishing chances of survival. And on a deeper, far more unsettling level, this clock becomes mortality's metronome, for the clock symbolizes our fundamental relationship with mortality itself, where the countdown is not simply toward the game's end, but instead is a stark reminder of how all of humanity operates under the same ultimate deadline. But unlike natural death, this artificial timekeeper becomes a chilling representation of how systems of power have co-opted even our relationship with mortality and transformed it into another tool for control, even for those whose time is already running out. And what are the shapes? What do they represent in this most twisted of plays? They serve, in truth, as a complex and brutal metaphor for both social mobility and systemic inequality. Firstly, they reveal a false choice architecture, wherein that initial selection of shapes, circle, triangle, star, umbrella, presents nothing more than a cruel illusion of free will, carefully masking predetermined outcomes. Like actors on a stage, they believe themselves in command of their destiny, whilst in truth, that destiny was already written into the script. This mirrors our own society, wherein the so-called choices we are so often presented, education paths, career options, and financial decisions, appear equitable, whilst in truth they are filled with hidden barriers and those predetermined difficulties. The very fact that the players choose their shapes completely blind to what lies ahead, and without any knowledge of the significance of a shape itself, speaks directly to how systemic inequalities are so carefully obscured until it is far too late to change course. And here we have a geometric hierarchy for the varying difficulty levels of each of the four shapes create a literal geometry of inequality, wherein the circle, being the simplest, represents baseline survival, the minimal path through this sinister system, and the umbrella, with its complex curves and angles, represents the almost insurmountable barriers that are faced by those who are dealt the worst possible hand. That progression of difficulty, mirrored throughout all parts of our own society, where social mobility becomes increasingly impossible as one moves up the social ladder, proves that this is far more than a mere game. Behold the tragedy, wherein form is fate, where once that shape is chosen, the players cannot switch to another, thus revealing how those very early life circumstances often determine future possibilities. Just as these players must now work within the confines of their chosen shape, all the while individuals must navigate life within those pre-existing boundaries of their inherited social, economic, and cultural circumstances, forever shackled to the lot that was predetermined for them. And now, let us address the Dalgona Candy itself, which emerges as one of the most devastating symbols within this most brutal episode. Let us unpack its layered meanings, for it becomes corrupted nostalgia, wherein childhood innocence itself has been weaponized, a sweet memory turned lethal, mirroring how capitalism so often co-opts and corrupts those pure experiences, transforming childhood games into the cruelest gambling, playtime into relentless productivity, and even one's memories into marketable commodities. The very fact that the players recognize this treat from their childhood adds another layer of psychological torment to the cruel machinations of the game, wherein brittle dreams are made manifest, for the candy's fragile nature, its tendency to shatter at the slightest of missteps, serves as a metaphor for the precarious nature of survival under the constant pressure of late capitalism. Just as the players are now forced to delicately navigate the brittle honeycomb, so too are the working classes forced to carefully maneuver through a system wherein one wrong move can lead to financial or social death. The structure itself, that sugar's crystalline fragility, is a perfect metaphor for those societal structures which appear attractive whilst being specifically designed to break under the pressure that is placed upon them, making clear that all those opportunities we are presented with are nothing more than ingeniously designed traps. And in that very edible nature of the challenge, we witness that consumable lives are the goal, for the players are now literally trying to survive through a very careful consumption of a commercial product where modern society reduces human existence to those mere consumable units, wherein one's survival now depends upon their relationship with commercial goods and services, and the very act of carefully destroying the candy whilst unable to consume it in the normal manner further emphasizes the perversion of human relationships with both pleasure and that very sustenance that is meant to keep us alive. Now consider the dormitory, wherein all are equal, and yet no one is. In this episode, it functions as a microcosm of controlled society, a carefully designed stage in which our most brutal instincts are placed upon full display. In its very design, we witness the concept of artificial equality, for the dormitory's uniform beds and its identical spaces create a facade of equality between those players, where CEOs sleep beside laborers and gangsters sleep beside students. However, this forced and cruel equality, which has been forced upon them, only serves to highlight the brutal inequality of the game itself, where all are equal in their suffering. Like modern society's carefully constructed myth of equal opportunity, this superficially level playing field merely masks those deeper systemic advantages and disadvantages that so often persist, regardless of the equality they pretend to represent. And what does that mean for us all, when we are so often governed by institutional control, where the dormitory's stark, prison-like quality makes clear how those institutions exercise their considerable power through spatial control, and here the players, much like inmates, are stripped of privacy and individuality. In those shared spaces, the ever-present surveillance mirrors modern society's increasing normalization of constant monitoring, be it through technology, social media, or institutional oversight, and what are we but puppets when reduced to mere numbers, controlled by a system so vast that it is almost entirely invisible to us? And finally, the dormitory, a testament to that twisted reality, becomes a pressure cooker, wherein all social tensions simmer and explode in equal measure. For that forced proximity of people from such different social classes and backgrounds creates a powder keg of resentment, alliance, and betrayal, mirroring how urban housing and economic pressures force such diverse groups into uneasy proximity, all the while neglecting to address those inherent underlying social tensions that so frequently explode into conflict. Thus do we reach the final scene where, as the last shards of honeycomb candy are carefully swept away by masked figures, the camera slowly pans across that dormitory, that hellhole made manifest, and there we see Gi-hun, sitting upon his bed, turning over a small fragment of that honeycomb, studying how that weak light catches its amber surface, as the camera pulls back to show the full scope of this brutal reality, the full impact of loss and despair, where we see some beds, now permanently empty, like missing teeth in a forced smile, a grim reminder of what has been lost, and to whom. In that background, a single player begins to hum a children's song, the same tune that once accompanied the innocent purchases of Dalgona on those sunny afternoons, a reminder of what was, and what can never be. And others join in, that melody spreading through that room like a brutal and unforgiving virus, a tune that is now distorted and bitter, transformed from a childhood memory into a mournful funeral dirge, and the camera pulls up from the level of those broken souls to show the vast scope of that dormitory, where the players are now reduced to tiny dots upon a vast grid, unconsciously arranging themselves into shapes: a circle, a triangle, a star, and, of course, the umbrella, and the lights begin to dim. But before darkness falls completely, we catch a brief glimpse of the next day's arena being prepared through a distant window, colorful and inviting, like a playground carefully constructed in hell. Oh, what a world we inhabit, wherein the screen cuts to black, and all we are left with is the sounds of that children's song, its innocence now forever tainted by the taste of honeycomb and the sound of shattering candy, and wherein we are left with a haunting reminder that in this game, as in our own society, even our sweetest memories can become the very weapons used against us. And now, let us turn our gaze to another scene, to the dormitory at night, a truly unsettling moment, wherein a single overhead light swings gently, its shadow sweeping across the floor like a slow, almost glacial metronome, and the camera drifts between the beds, wherein the players lie awake, their eyes reflecting the swaying light. Tick, shadow, talk, light, and there, we know, no one speaks, no one sleeps. For the collective trauma of that brutal day has stripped away their ability to do either, and we see in the corner a player methodically crushing the last remaining pieces of his honeycomb, letting the sweet, now tainted, powder fall through his fingers, the sound of grinding sugar echoing throughout, like breaking glass. Oh, how fragile and cruel is fate! As the others watch, transfixed, childhood itself dissolves into granules of death. The camera then pulls in tight upon Gi-hun's face as he stares at the ceiling, and in the swinging light, the water stains begin to form the shapes. A circle, bleeding into a triangle, morphing into a star, twisting into an umbrella, and the patterns start to move faster, dancing across the ceiling like some demented carousel, and all the while, the shadows of those shapes wash across his face, each pass aging him slightly, until we finally see the full weight of time's cruelty etched into his features, making clear the impact that this game has had. And then, suddenly, all sound is cut, except for that high-pitched whine, like the sharp edge of a needle against glass, and the camera begins to slowly rotate 180 degrees, turning that dormitory upside down, wherein the players now hang from their beds, like so many suspended corpses, while above and below them, that very floor becomes a vast honeycomb pattern, its cells filled with a dark liquid which begins to drip upward, defying gravity, and turning our notions of how the world should operate into a monstrous parody of the mundane. And in this twisted, horrific world, in that final shot, we pull back, up and out through that observation window, where a masked figure stands watching, and as the camera passes through their mask, we are briefly granted a glimpse of what they themselves see. Not people, but pieces upon a game board, each one trailing strings like puppet lines, that then extend up into that infinite darkness. The strings begin to twitch and tangle, forming the number for 156 before dissolving into the unfinished game of hopscotch from a long-forgotten childhood, and the screen cuts to black, but in that darkness, we hear only the soft voice of Aelnam, humming a lullaby which sounds eerily like the countdown timer, and under that subtle but inescapable sound of candy cracking, spreading like spider webs through the crushing silence, as childhood itself is broken, forever, by the brutality of that game. This ending not only transforms the physical space of that dormitory into nothing less than a psychological nightmare, but it also reveals the game's true nature, a perversion of childhood innocence and human dignity, suggesting that the real horror isn't in the deaths, but in that slow, agonizing dissolution of humanity under the crushing weight of the game's cruel and unforgiving logic.